I think it is 6 o'clock in Germany and 5 o'clock in the UK, so we might as well get started. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the German-British Association's session called Almost 100 Days of a New Government, a Fresh Start in the UK. Particular welcome to our panelists tonight, Constance Kampfner, journalist with The Times, Dr. Jochen Bittner, journalist with Die Zeit, and Jake Benford, who is with the Bertelsmann Foundation. May I just remind everybody that, as usual, this session will be recorded, which gives you a chance to listen to it all over again. It'll be up on our website. Of course, you're welcome to join the discussion, everybody. If you wish to do so, please put any questions or remarks in the chat, and we'll try and pick up some of them as we go along. You're obviously well trained to these sessions. You've all, I think, turned your microphone off. Please do so when you're not actually speaking, and you can leave your camera on or turn it off as you wish. If you find the connection is not very good, then you should perhaps turn it off. Okay, so let's get started. Almost 100 days of a new government. Everybody had expected the new government to come in. Nobody was very surprised, but there were, of course, a lot of expectations as to what the new government would actually do after a rather mixed goodbye to the Tory government that was defeated at the last general election. And we would like to touch on a few subjects. Of course, there are lots of them, but we'd just like to touch on a few of them. We'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on inside the UK, and perhaps devote a minute or two to the riots that have been going on throughout the summer. Of course, we do wish to talk a little bit about relations between the UK and the EU, and the UK and Germany. And then finally, we want to look at the role that civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations like the German-British Association, like the British-German Association in the UK, what role is there for organizations like that if we are to have a fresh start in our relations? Perhaps I can just start with you, Constance. You've, I think, just attended or will be attending party conferences. What's your feeling? What is the sort of the new government driving at in terms of what's going to happen in the UK?
So for full transparency, actually, the only conference I've attended this season is the Reform Party conference, which was an interesting experience, to say the least. But the tone very much from the Labour Party conference, which was a few days ago, was a surprising one for a government that has just scored a massive majority. You know, it was quite downbeat. There was not the same sense of optimism in the air that there was this time last year when Labour was riding high in the polls. And that really encapsulated the sort of slightly damp squib feeling of this start of this Labour government, which has been one marked by a sense of what people are calling miserabilism. You know, we're thinking a lot about tax rises coming ahead. Investor confidence is down. There were the riots that you referred to, which were a pretty depressing way to get started, you know, just a few weeks after taking power. And so there is certainly not that same kind of optimistic mood that they will have been hoping for at this point. And meanwhile, we have the Tory conference that started today, and that is also one marked by quite a lot of turning inwards, infighting, and not kind of grand visions for the future of the UK.
Jochen Bittner, would you share that view, or would you say one should be more optimistic, and the politicians are more optimistic? What's your take on that?
I would certainly share the analysis. I went to Liverpool to the Labour conference for 3 days, and the mood was celebrity. I mean, they had to celebrate, coming back into government after 15 years of opposition. So that was a celebratory course in itself. But I completely agree with Constance that in substance, there wasn't many joyful things to hear. Keir Starmer's speech, I found, was not really revigorating. I had expected him to come up with much more substance, with much more vision, if you will. Same with Angela Rayner's speech, Rachel Reeves' speech. There was a lot of trying, to beat people, to cheer people up in an abstract, in an intellectual way. But where we would actually be going from here, that's the message I missed. And the truth is, I mean, the money is not there. The UK is just lacking the money to be cheerful at the moment. So I would say that, of course, apart from the obvious main task of the Starmer government to kickstart the economy, what baffles me a bit is that Starmer appears to have seen before the election what lays ahead of him politically, and this is a project that I would call project recoupling. He needs to recouple both the political class with the constituents in Great Britain, and on a second level that you of course also want to talk about later, he wants to recouple the UK with Europe again.
Yeah.
But I think this project recoupling has seen some setbacks over the summer, and I'm very happy to talk about the riots and what these mean for Labour, because the honeymoon phase, the last 100 days, they haven't been a success for Labour. If you look at the polls, let me just give you two figures here. Around a quarter of all Labour voters by now say that they came to regret having cast their vote for Labour. And Starmer's popularity has plummeted to minus 21% points. The popularity here is measured in disapproval and approval, and the net figure from this. So 21% more of the people who were asked about Starmer disapprove of him than approve of him. And just to put this into context, when Tony Blair was at the same point in time as Starmer is now, 3 months after taking office, he was at a figure at plus 65%. So yes, there was a landslide victory, but it was, as another journalist put it here, a loveless landslide. And the project recoupling, well, the first big challenge, of course, were the riots. These were people who were partly racist, partly extremists, but in large numbers, there were also people who were, disenfranchised with the political class, who felt that they had no voice in Westminster, that they hadn't been heard for too long. And I believe that Starmer missed a chance here to deliver the message that, of course, criminals have to be punished swiftly and harshly. But on the other hand, he also could have, sent back the message to peaceful protesters, look, we get you. We know you're worried about the high levels of immigration. We know you're worried about the cost of living crisis. We know you're worried about white working class men. And this message he failed to deliver. And this is why I would say this goes to show, as one example, why project recoupling isn't really taking off.
Thank you. what baffled me over the summer was that the new government should put the issue of the reform of the House of Lords so high up on the agenda. I mean, it's not terribly important, really, considering how politics sort of work in the UK. You know, why did they start off on that one immediately? They could have done that, I don't know, next year or the year after next or whenever. Yeah. You have a take, either of you?
It's cheap, I think, would be my main take. I mean, so much of what needs doing in Britain are kind of massive capital infrastructure projects that, you know, there simply is not the budget for currently. And I agree with you. I think it looks quite inward looking, perhaps to the average voter, that this would be something to focus on early on. But if you look at a lot of the policies that the government has focused on quite early on, it is things that either kind of recoup some investment or
So what you're saying, do I understand this correctly? What you're saying is, as there's no money for sort of real reform, they're putting things on the agenda that don't cost anything, and the House of Lords is perhaps one of them. Yeah. Is that, would you second that, Johan?
Well, I mean, on the other hand, Keir Starmer is quite frank about the costs to reform, to reset the country. I mean, he doesn't stop talking about this 22 billion black hole in the budget that somehow needs to be filled. And he also said that some taxes will have to be raised. He is always talking about sparing working people from tax raises, whatever working people may mean. But it became clear, for instance, so for all you owning property somewhere outside in the UK and having your domicile inside the UK, hard times ahead because the non-dom status is about to be abolished next year. So that's one message. But also, you know, what caused quite a stir here, I mean, nationally and at the Labour conference, was that the fuel subsidies, the heating fuel subsidies for the elderly pensioners, they will get scrapped to a large extent. They will still be there for those in real need over the winter. But so one of the first cuts that Starmer did actually affected people who might very well need these forms of allowances to keep their houses warm over the winter. And this caused quite some protest during the Labour conference. So I mean, I think he knows, you know, he has to tell the electorate that they are in for a hard time or for a couple of hard years, and he's honest to that extent. But what I've been still missing, is what is his idea to kickstart the economy? What is the big idea for the new Britain that he's talking about? You know, he's using phrases like a Britain that belongs to you all the time. What's that supposed to mean? I mean, who else should Britain belong to? The Emperor of Japan, or who? I mean, it's these kind of, you know, PR speech bits and pieces that I think frustrate more people than actually convince anybody.
Jake, you know both countries very well indeed, and you know that social security issues and old age pension issues are very much on people's minds in both countries. And there is very much less money around than there was. What sort of aim could a new Labour government have, in a way? How are they going to get out of this?
Well, the big challenge the UK has is a very toxic, difficult combination of very low productivity, driven by low investment, low growth on the one hand, and high inequality on the other hand. Not necessarily rising inequality, but in absolute terms, in relative terms, high inequality. With that, I mean regional, geographic inequality. And this is a state of affairs which hits households directly, immediately. If you look at some of the modelling done by UK economists comparing British households with German households, French households, Dutch households, the type of countries the UK likes to compare itself with, some of the figures are dramatic. So if you're a middle income household in the UK, you're 20% poorer than your equivalent in Germany. If you're in a poor household in the UK, you're 25% poorer than your counterpart in a country like Germany or France. And this is 25% of a very low income. Explains food banks and so on and so forth. And the issue is, of course, that if you want to tackle these two, you're in for the long haul, right? If you want to raise productivity and growth, you have to invest. You have to invest in infrastructure. You have to invest in skills. You have to invest in innovation. And if you want to tackle inequality, these are long-term adjustments and changes to the social contract. So that is the big picture for the UK. Now, I agree that the start has been hesitant, it's been uncertain. The political optics have been, in part, quite terrible. Some of the errors really did seem unforced. The honeymoon ended very abruptly, and the cynical view, of course, is cynical, but people do point out that Labour didn't win this election, rather the Conservatives lost it. But I would perhaps call for some perspective here and say that the real measuring stick, the real yardstick for the UK is slow, steady, incremental improvement. Someone in the UK called this radical incrementalism. That's what the UK needs. I thought that was a good way of putting it. Very difficult in the current climate where expectations are high and where people expect a lot, but none of this can be achieved in 100 days. So I do see the problems, but I would call for perhaps some restraint in making immediate judgments and instead taking some time. And I think that applies also to expectations on the part of citizens when it comes to issues like the NHS and the big domestic problems the UK has. So just to make that last point, you can't expect to pay taxes like in the US and then receive services like in Norway or the Netherlands, right? I mean, these things really don't work. And what has happened in the UK is my analysis from here over the last few years is that there's been an unwillingness or even inability to really openly address trade-offs and talk about trade-offs and be clear. And Labour has sort of tried to tackle this, but not really politically. The narrative has gone slightly wrong. So expectation management is key. Taking some time for these things to pan out are key. We'll have to take it from there, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you used a sort of key word, long haul or long term. The big question is, does the government have enough time to sort of deal with these sort of long-term issues, or will they be caught up in sort of short-term problems in a very short time?
Well, I think they should be given that time. Obviously, that's not always how politics works, and much of the Labour Party will be considering or trying to work out at the moment how to get re-elected. But there is a roadmap. There are ideas out there which perhaps haven't been put forward by the government, but there are ways forward for the UK. One a big challenge will be to realign with Europe, but I don't think that's going to be the major challenge. If you have a productivity gap, which is about 1/5 compared to Germany, okay, a product that's 1/5, just to repeat that. So in terms of value produced by the UK economy, it's as if the British people stop working on a Thursday evening, right? Of course they don't. They work harder and longer than in many other countries, but the productivity is low. So if you want to tackle these kind of issues, you have to make big decisions. And for instance, the UK is a services economy. There's major strength in services. Decisions can be made to build on that. start with an honest analysis of what the UK is good at. The UK will not be like Germany. It's not a manufacturing country. I mean, Germany won't be for much longer either, the way things are going. But it's important to focus on one's own strengths. That's where the UK can go. And again, take time to move forward. I do think, I mean, the question of political reform came up, House House Lords, so forth, PR. That's a tricky one. I mean, you know, I can kind of understand the skepticism of sort of tackling this right now when there are more pressing issues. But I would remind people that in the course of the Brexit wars, the political system in the UK really did come under pressure. It really does probably need some kind of reform. It's a highly centralized state compared to pretty much every other highly developed economy in Europe. It's not sustainable in that sense. One of the reasons I would put forward that the UK is not really getting off the ground well, and that also applies to the EU themes, which we may talk about in a moment, is that some of the key positions in the civil service haven't really been filled. And the moment that happens in a highly centralized state, you have in immediate limbo, things don't happen, the system can't really get. So there's a lot to do here too. So a lot of homework for the UK, I guess one would have to say, but I would call for time and the long-term view, even if that's often very difficult.
Okay, Jochen, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, I just wanted to support Jake's thesis that we are in for the long haul here. But if I compare the UK to the long-term perspectives of Germany, I actually, in a couple of fields, I see UK on a better trajectory than Germany. Take services, take industry. I mean, what we are seeing in Germany is traditional industries under strain, if not even dying. Take the automotive industry, backbone of the German economy. One could be cynical and say that the UK is past this point already of, you know, industrial downturn. But what we see at the same time is a huge optimism for the new industry, the new revolution in tech with AI, for instance. And I think the energy policy of the UK is much more clever than the German one. I mean, the UK is building offshore and onshore wind now, investing in solar, plus investing in nuclear energy, new big power plants, also small modular reactors, maybe just in a couple of years to be built by Rolls-Royce and other companies across the country. And that's crucially important if you want to be a nation that is able to invest in artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence will consume huge amounts of power. And I don't see Germany preparing for this on an infrastructure level, as well as on a political regulatory level. So this might actually turn out to be one of the upsides of Brexit for the UK, to not have to be engaged in the EU's AI regulation scheme, to come up with something between the two worlds of the Wild West in the US and the, let's say, over-regulation in the EU. So the UK might become a very attractive place for investments in AI, mid long term. And but having said that, I still wanted to touch on the cultural dimension of the Labour government, if I may, for a second.
Yes, please.
Just because this is the case that, you know, economic improvement will be only in for the long haul. I just don't understand why Starmer has ceased sending signals to the political center ground as he used to during the election campaign. During the election campaign, I think he played a very clever game in signaling to, let's say, culturally conservative voters that he would be on their side. He not only purged the Labour Party of the Corbynistas and the anti-Semites and the hard left, he also, for instance, he wrote an op-ed in the Telegraph, of all newspapers, making clear that as far as he's concerned, everybody should be happy in flying their St. George's flag on St. George's Day, with which he wanted to show that we should stop talking Britain down. Labour is the party of the patriots now. You don't have to vote Tories to be a patriot. And I think that was quite clever of him. And it appears that once he entered government, this tone has completely ceased. But he needs to address voters who are fed up with the Tories and not yet convinced of the Labour government, on who are considering voting either Labour or Reform at the next election, because Reform is gearing up as the new party of the working class. That's a very, very interesting development here. They are not only capitalizing or preying on former Tory voters. Also, they Reform came second in about 100 constituencies in the north. So they are in the red wall. They are a huge threat to Labour, and I think Constanze will know much more about this. So Starmer, it isn't enough for him to have purged Labour of the loony lefties. He also needs to move the party into a new center, which he also needs to create politically.
Wow, that's interesting, Constance. You've just attended the Reform Party's conference. Tell us, will the Reform Party become a permanent sort of element in British politics?
I certainly don't think it's going anywhere. And to pick up on that last point, I mean, one of the first people I spoke to at this conference and had a really interesting conversation with was a lifelong Liberal Democrat voter who had transitioned to the Reform Party. So a lot of the old ideas about who Reform or UKIP or whichever iteration you want to speak about are kind of out of date. And I was there on election night with Nigel Farage and his entourage, and even they were completely shocked by how well they were doing, coming second in so many Labour seats. And I think, we always kind of talk about the difference between populism and pragmatism and all these things. And if you look at America, where on an objective level, if you read the Wall Street Journal, the economy is doing pretty well, actually, especially in comparison to a lot of European economies. That is not the message that a lot of Americans are taking home. It's not the message that they're receiving at supermarkets, where cost of living and cost of produce is extremely high. And that's going to be the big gamble. It's all going to be about kind of timing. Can you not just run an economy well, invest, but can you capitalize on those returns fast enough within an electoral cycle, before you can allow this kind of more attractive populist message to take over, because that is the risk of kind of miserablism, as we've been talking about. And this week as well has coincided with lots of excerpts from Boris Johnson's new memoir being published, all these stories coming out. I mean, there was one today about how he was never actually going to go for a no-deal Brexit. He just wanted people to think he was crazy. I mean, take from that what you will. But it's a reminder, actually, that a lot of Brits, you might think this is crazy, but a lot of people quite miss him. They're quite nostalgic for his brand of cavalier politics and energy, and it's in very stark contrast to what we're seeing from Labour.
Very, very, very true. Now, before we switch to sort of bilateral international affairs, I do just want to read one question, well, it's two actually, from Anne Packard, who's joined us from Edinburgh. And her question goes like this: do panel members consider Starmer should have indicated winter fuel issue? Should it have been in the manifesto, or indeed this year issued at 50% or previous to soften the blow? And number two, and should the entire electorate hold him in contempt for lack of transparency for the array of gifts accepted from a member of the upper house he wishes to abolish. Now, who wants to take that on? Either question.
Since I mentioned the winter fuel allowance, I mean, of course, it would have been more honest if they would have been put in the manifesto in the first place. But then again, you don't want to put off too many people in the first place. But I mean, what Labour are claiming now is they didn't have full insight into how miserable the budget really was, and only that after they've taken office and seen the figures, seen the papers, could they decide on what cuts to make. That sounds well reasonable or justifiable, at least. The second question, sorry, I just forgot. Still jet lagged. The second question.
The second question was, should the entire electorate hold him, Starmer, in contempt for lack of transparency for the array of gifts accepted from a member of the upper house he wishes to abolish?
Right. Well, just to maybe tell the entire audience what happened. Starmer had accepted, freebies in forms of designer clothing, glasses, football tickets, worth, I think, more than £100,000 over the last couple of years from a donor. And this was true for some other Labour grandees as well, who received clothing or Taylor Swift concert tickets. So, and this all went public now, and of course they all apologized, but they all said, well, it was all declared, it was all transparent in the books. It was, a form of support for our party during the election campaign. But of course, it has a very bitter taste to it, because at the same time at which you announced that pensioners might not be able to receive funding for their winter fuel any longer, you do so sitting in a TV studio with your designer jacket on that somebody else paid for. A very, very bad picture indeed.
Yeah, I mean, one would have thought that Starmer and the others were too intelligent after what politics has gone through in the UK over the past, 10, 15 years in this respect. Why they didn't abstain from this sort of thing. I mean, one can't believe it. Jake, you were trying to say something, sorry.
No, I mean, so to answer the question, I don't think the entire electorate should hold Keir Starmer and his team in contempt. I do see the absurdity of the optics of this, quite literally. I think it reminded people in the UK of the expenses scandal back in 2008, when over the course of a year, the British political class was humiliated and lost all its dignity, as it were. I think there's a deeper problem here. I mean, I was cycling past the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung this morning on my way to work. I don't know whether you've been there. This is a sort of think tank foundation, politically affiliated with the German Christian Democrats, and the Green Party have their own setup, and the SPD have their own setup, and so on and so forth. And it did remind me of the difference in funding and support that political parties receive in the UK compared to Germany. And there's a debate you can have on this, but I mean, what the argument for such support is, it sort of does add to the dignity of your elected representatives to behave and present themselves in a certain kind of way. And if you don't do that, it goes off into other directions. That's not to excuse some sort of terrible political misjudgment on the part of senior Labour politicians, but the people who are now critical of that may have been equally critical of their prime minister looking rather terrible if he hadn't. So I'd be more balanced, but of course, it's a political misjudgment, and it has a deeper point with regard to the funding of British politicians.
It's raised some quite awkward questions, actually, in Britain. I mean, yes, completely on the optics, but do we want to do we want taxpayers to pay for our political parties? If the answer to that is no, then you have to ask, well, where can you get that money from? And the answer is obviously private donations. And then you ask, well, you know, what is the difference between paying for some very nice looking leaflets, glossy leaflets, and paying to look prime ministerial? And there's also been quite a lot of questions asked of the same media organizations that are poking holes in all of this. You know, I mean, Keir Starmer was on Sky News the other day and said, well, it's one thing for you to criticize me for accepting hospitality, but I am invited by Sky News constantly to these rather expensive events. Now, you are doing that because you would like to be close to people in positions of power. But if we are going to criticize these things, it opens up a lot of questions for a lot of different parts of society.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I do like that point, Constance, and I think there's I do respect the fact that Starmer is sort of holding his ground and trying to explain the situation and sort of levy with people and be as clear as he can. I mean, I'm not sure it's working, but I do respect the attempt. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the German politician Habeck, who from time to time has this ability to just literally level with people and just talk to people quite normally. I remember an interview in the German Tagesthemen, sort of equivalent of the 10 o'clock news, where he was criticized for having gone to Qatar to set up some kind of energy deal. This was in the midst of the Russian attack. And he said, look, you know, what do you expect me to do? We need energy. You know, we may not like these people, but we have to work with them. And some perhaps politicians would be surprised at how well this can play if you just talk directly and sort of levy with people and say what the situation is. But I do agree that there's a bigger picture. And does the UK want to go in the American direction where it's all privately funded, you know, where step one to becoming prime minister would be to be a millionaire? That's not wanted either, right? So it's probably a wake-up call to sort out party political funding once and for all.
Okay, yeah. With that, I think we should turn to sort of bilateral and international affairs, having talked about UK domestic issues up to now. And there, of course, we have seen a very clear line taken by the new government to put both UK-Europe relations and UK-Germany relations back on track. Let's start with the European ones. And I can see you all sort of smiling or grinning, whatever. Is Starmer delivering on that point? Has she started to deliver on UK-EU relations? Who'd like to start?
Shall I?
Yes, please.
But in a way, he has started. He has started in terms of, you know, setting the mood or setting a new attitude when he invited half of Europe to Blenheim Palace right after he had taken office. I think it was a week within him having taken office. We saw the big summit of the European political community at Blenheim, which was a fantastic opportunity, obviously, for Starmer to shake 40 odd hands of chiefs of state and prime ministers. But you know, as far as I can know, what took place there was just, you know, a declaration of intent, a very festive declaration of intent. And the intent is that the Labour government looks at Europe differently, looks at Europe as a partner, as a club of friends, as opposed to a club of bureaucrats that just wants to, you know, run its fetters around Britain. So this idea is gone. He wanted to show. He reached out, of course, in substance as well. And I think it was very clever of him to come up with the idea to forge a defense pact with Europe, because from this And that's the entire idea. And Jake knows much more about this than I in detail. But the idea is to get a foot into Europe by strengthening defense cooperation and to set around this defense idea a whole array of other issues where the relationships between Britain and Europe may improve in very practical terms, you know, from youth mobility to veterinary agreements. Very, very many small steps. At the same time, I think also we are in for the long haul here. I don't expect anything substantial to happen before spring, let's say, because we first need the European Commission in place in Brussels. These are people that the Brits also have to talk with. They know that, so you can't leave them aside. And then again, Starmer has to tread very carefully because the road towards Europe is a minefield for him politically. You know, Nigel Farage and the Daily Mail stand ready to open fire on him by claiming that, look, what those aloof lefties really intend is to undo Brexit. And we are just seeing the first steps of them trying to do this. So he has to act very cautiously. Special matter of concern for him certainly is youth mobility, because the problem is that every student who would come to Britain to study for, let's say, 2 or 3 years would be counted as immigration, thereby increasing the migration figures. And that's exactly what the Labour government doesn't need. They want to bring down immigration. So one solution might be to actually decouple, you know, immigration from student exchange, also in a statistical way. Would be pretty important, I believe. But I just wanted to give you a feeling of, you know, how beleaguered the Labour government is here as soon as they start a rapprochement with Europe.
Thank you. Before the others come in, I just wanted to point to a snag in this UK-EU defence partnership. The snag is the EU the right kind of a partner for this? Because in the EU, there are 27, including 2 at the moment, probably 3 in a very short time, who will not toe the line on defense issues with the others. And it will always be, there are a lot of unanimous decisions to be made, and there will always be some country, perhaps a very small one, that will oppose the decision. So it's a very cumbersome procedure to discuss defense and security issues. And that's why I wonder a little bit whether to concentrate on defense and security is sort of the right approach. What do you feel about this, Jake, Constance, whoever?
Sure. So it's a very good question. I'm happy to dive into that. Perhaps just to take a step back and start with the broader picture of EU-UK relations, and then we'll move into the defense field, which is broadly defense industrial cooperation and plans the EU has in this field. So you probably know the saying that happiness is expectations minus reality, right? And I think this really does apply to this relationship. It's all about managing expectations. If you look at the way this relationship is set up at the moment, you have on the one hand probably still the widest and deepest bilateral relationship that exists in the international context, which at the same time seems very much unfinished. And this means we have a list of about 20 subjects, so not a sort of never-ending list, but a sort of clearly defined list of around 20 subjects, which are up for debate. And I'd say there's probably 3 groups of subjects. The subjects where negotiations are ongoing, partly because there's a legal requirement to have these negotiations. So that would include issues such as Gibraltar, which is still part of the withdrawal agreement. It also includes issues like fisheries. So these are ongoing negotiations that happen every year. There's the youth mobility issue, let's call it a subject being negotiated and stops and starts. Then there's a second group of subjects which aren't being negotiated in reality, but where at least one party has publicly stated that they want changes, and I'm thinking in particular of the issues raised by the Labour Party and SPS agreement, aspects of mobility and the security pact, of course. Some people would put it in the first category, but I'm told there are no genuine negotiations on this. There's nothing in writing, nothing genuinely happening here. And then, of course, there's a third group of projects, let's call them future projects, right? Where issues are not being negotiated. They've not been voiced officially by one of the two parties or put forward, but others, think tanks, and of course, unofficially from within government, we know that these are areas where the two should be cooperated. Talking about export controls, talking about things like climate diplomacy, talking about essentially trying to get some kind of united European front going when it comes to industrial policy, economic security, and so on and so forth. But nothing is really happening here. What's missing, of course, is any kind of political leadership, any kind of overriding sort of political direction. It's not to say that there have been no conversations, but there's no sort of broader picture here, and dare I say, any kind of vision. For that to happen, it would require meetings. It requires structured discussions. There's one going on this week. So Starmer will be meeting von der Leyen this week, and the EU Minister Nick Thomas Simmons met with Šefčovič today. So this is a week of things happening. But again, I'd manage expectations and say it's not like they're going to walk out with a new game plan. This is going to be a long, complicated relationship. I would, at this point, perhaps just say one thing. What we're hearing from the EU system all the time is, what do the Brits really want? Okay, have they confronted all the different trade-offs? Do they have a vision for their role in Europe and so forth? Fair enough, but it's not like the EU system is ready and geared up to deal and construct with this kind of partnership, because the UK is different. The UK is different in terms of proximity, in terms of values, in terms of existing integration, and it's not like there's going to be a partnership off the peg. It's not going to be Norway or Turkey. It's going to be a new type of arrangement. And does the EU have the flexibility? Does it have the political coherence, the ability to strategize, to be the geopolitical player it wants to be, and so on? So big questions for the EU system too. But last sentence, what it feels like is that two sides are still trying to connect with each other, still trying to find a way in, and not quite managing to do this, which leads to false starts like the proposals by the Commission on Youth Mobility, which were never acceptable in the UK, and so on and so forth. So again, a long-term process, unfortunately. And last point, not sure whether we have time for that, because there's elections in the US and there's all sorts of other things happening in the world. So something to speed up. That was a long answer, and I didn't talk about defense, but we'll get back to that in a moment.
Absolutely. Just in between, I would encourage you to read what's been put in the chat, because we can't read out all the comments that are there, but they are actually quite interesting. So do read them sort of in between. I just wanted to quickly ask Constance, is the Reform Party already trying to sort of set the agenda for firing at anything that happens? Are they sort of really belligerent about it?
It's a really great question, and I think they are they're poised to kind of jump in at the first sign that Starmer is getting too kind of cozy, as they would see it, with the EU, and so I think that is maybe one of the things preventing him and Britain from kind of setting out any kind of vision for what a relationship with Europe might look like. You could say it's sort of tinkering. And I think, Reform have never been so kind of professionalized, actually. They've now got MPs in Parliament, which is a big coup. But equally, they are professionalizing right from the top. And I think that we will see a slicker operation. They, interestingly, as a side note, just fired their head of comms, who was one of the great British political survivors. I mean, nobody survives a relationship with Nigel Farage for more than 3 or 4 years. I mean, this man has managed to stay by his side for well over 2 decades. So that's a sign of just quite how serious they are about this new era. And I think it'll be really interesting to see whether they kind of fill a void that is being left perhaps by the Conservative Party while they are on this protracted course to find their new leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick remark from you before we switch to German UK relations.
Yes, yeah, no, I just wanted to add that this, let's say, quality of Nigel Farage applies not only to EU issues. He is a political terrier. You know, he senses weaknesses in others and exploits them mercilessly. And one of the big weaknesses that he sees in Starmer, and not only he actually, is that Starmer has great difficulty coming across as an authentic speaker, as somebody who speaks his mind, you know, saying things as he believes them. And Farage is the complete opposite. And in so far, this latest slip, I don't know if you saw that, or the gaffe that that Starmer made during his conference speech. He said that he demanded or he called for the release of the sausages in Gaza. He wanted to say the hostages, but he said the release of the sausages. Now these kinds of things, they tend to happen, I think, when you read from autocue. And you have your mind set on what is written there and not on what you actually want to say, what is in your brain, but rather what is on the paper in front of you. And this is one weakness that Farage doesn't have. Quite the opposite. He really speaks his mind, he speaks his heart, and he is an incredibly good communicator.
One sometimes wonders how Starmer did in court when he was a public prosecutor. I mean, he must have delivered speeches there.
Yeah, that's interesting because, you know, being a barrister, having to convince a judge is something different than having to convince a crowd.
Yeah, probably.
You know, you come up with facts. You cannot prove. You have to be calm and to the point. Whereas to move a crowd is something else than to convince a judge.
Yeah. Let's just spend a few moments. We don't have very much more time anyway. A few moments on UK and Germany. When during this whole Brexit time, pre-Brexit and Brexit time, at all conferences, Königswinter conferences, etc., UK delegates would sort of sidle up to one at the bar and say, can't we have a special relationship between the UK and Germany? And we would always have to tell them, no, sorry, you have to make your deal with Brussels first. And then, now, obviously the deal with Brussels has been made and things, so there is a certain openness to have a special relationship, and it's, but what should it consist of? What is it that UK and Germany can sort of agree on, just the two of them, without involving the EU? I sometimes wonder. Jake, do you want to?
Well, the should question is obviously very, very difficult, but there was a very good question. We'll probably start with what's in the pipeline. I mean, broadly, there's 2 things in the pipeline. I'm talking about the next 6 months or so. So on the one hand, there are plans, of course, for an Anglo-German defence partnership, which would resemble the Lancaster House Pact that the UK has with France. This is a pact from back in 2010. So this is about sort of creating joint forces and sharing equipment, nuclear missile research centers, things like that. And this dates back to conversations that happened under the Sunak government. So this is not entirely, you know, this has a slightly longer backstory. And there is a Labour initiative to expand that into a broader Anglo-German bilateral treatment, which may cover aspects of trade and innovation, technology, environment, illegal migration, so on and so forth. So that is something which the German government, we know, hopes to announce sometime next year. And the former part, the defense part, would sort of be a pillar in that treaty. So there are developments here. This is very much the sort of UK Foreign Office approach to go for bilateral agreements. I think on defense, it's fully understandable. You asked earlier on about defense in the EU context, Rupert, where the EU has plans for a single market to create defense industrial capacities, but no one knows where the money is going to come from. Probably need at least 50 billion to start. Some say up to 300 billion, and currently there's 1.5 billion, made ready for this. So from the UK perspective, it's sort of a big plan where we will be excluded on current trends, but it may not materialize anyway. It makes sense to push for the bilateral relationship, and that's happening, and the German government has been open to this and responded to this, and there'll be movement on this. And of course, the question then will be how to integrate that with any possible security pact at EU level, which, however, is pretty unlikely to happen very, very quickly. So some progress there, and I would say that is a positive development broadly.
But one sometimes gets the impression that these defense partnerships, both with France and with Germany, are sort of more symbolic than anything else, because I mean our defense is NATO, and I mean, what should a defense partnership, what should it deliver? But yeah, anyway, it's a sort of a positive symbol, perhaps. Anybody else would like to come in on this? No, you all feel that's
We're waiting for the treaty, and I think that may be a smart, a good approach, especially from journalists. Wait until you see it.
I mean, what it could deliver, to put it blunt, is more bang for the buck. So the ammunition depots in all European countries are depleted.
Yes.
Everybody needs to fill them to give more to Ukraine, or even bolster their own defenses now. So the idea is to pool resources, be able to produce more with less personnel and less money.
Yeah.
It's exactly that. It's about efficiency, and the EU has plans to do that across the entire EU. That is the big idea, but impossible to.
But there were huge obstacles to sort of a real partnership. I read that constructing a tank together, Germans and British, has never worked because the Brits wanted a device to make tea in the tank, and the Germans said, no, we won't have that. So just to show where the real issues are. Yes. Final quick remark. What role for, non-governmental civil society organizations are there? What role for us? What can we do? Constance, do you have any suggestions?
I wouldn't tell you what to do. I wouldn't dream of it, Rupert. But I suppose the one thought I'd come in, and it's slightly parallel, so I hope you forgive me, but it's the kind of sentencing that we've seen of some activists recently in Britain has worried quite a lot of kind of civil society organizations. And I'm talking about climate change protesters here who are kind of planning to block motorways, receiving some of the, in one case, the heftiest sentence for peaceful protests that we've seen.
Any suggestion? What should we be doing?
Yeah, maybe you should pretend that nothing happened. I mean, that Brexit didn't happen, because to retreat from activity just because there's this greater political distance now between the two countries would be the wrong reaction. I've been here for half a year now, or 8 months in this posting in London. And I'm overwhelmed by the interest of both the editors back in Hamburg and Berlin and our readers. They are keen on all things British, and decide ourselves. We have made the mistake in the past to somehow write off Britain because of Brexit, and we only installed the correspondent now at the beginning of this year. And it turns out that we should have done so years ago, because I think we should never confuse Brexit with the strong links that people still feel between each other. There's still, Britain is a cultural superpower. It's the most, I would say, historically the most important nation in Europe. And I feel this every day in my work. And so to highlight Britain might also have an impact on policymakers.
Wow, that's a challenge. Yeah. Jake, anything to add to that?
Well, I'd agree with that sentiment and the gist of what Jochen said. I think it's spot on. I think there's an augmented role, as it were, for organizations such as this and other civil science to sort of move into that gap. I think there's this underlying body of Anglophilia in Germany which won't really go away, but it could, because if you stopped sending people to go to university in the UK, whether it's for a year or for a degree or for their postgraduate, if you stop having academics going to UK universities, if you stop the cultural exchange programs, if you stop the school visits, that has an impact. If you talk today to decision makers in Germany, I'd say, this is my guess, we should do a survey maybe, I'd say at least 40, maybe 50% have had some kind of formative experience in their life in the UK. And they like the UK, and they try to understand the UK, and they despair over the UK, but they engage with the UK, right? Much more than people in the UK, and maybe not this audience, but people in the UK engage with Europe. But that can die, that can change, and that will change. I mean, how could it not? People go and look elsewhere. So I think that gap needs to be filled, and I think organizations like this will only grow in importance.
Yeah. And of course, now that just a little story at the end, for a large part of civil society, not for the whole of civil society, but for a large part of civil society, sort of national categories have faded away anyway. I made a terrible fool of myself once when we had a student working for us, and he liked to go on sort of demonstrations and rallies and things. And he went to Hamburg when G7 met in Hamburg, and he was not belligerent at all. He was a perfectly peaceful chap, but he joined sort of all kinds of things there, and came back. And so we asked him, what his experiences were. And at some point, I asked him, from what countries did the others come? And he looked at me and said, what's that got to do with it? And he was right, of course. I'd made a fool of myself. So the thing is, if you leave sort of government circles, you very quickly downgrade sort of nationalities and national issues, and you're talking much more about sort of, yes, international, transnational things. And so hopefully we can proceed on that line. Now we're already beyond the time, and people are actually leaving us because they have other commitments. Thank you all very, very much indeed. We haven't been able to touch on everything that we promised we would. But thank you for coming in, giving us a lot of insight, the three of you from different sort of angles, and thank everybody else. Thank you everybody else for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you all soon. And we'll be reading what our journalist friends will be writing about matters, and what think tank people like Jake will be producing. So we'll be kept abreast of developments. Thank you very much indeed, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.